Hello, my friends. Welcome to the Greg Krino Show. My guest today is a good friend of mine who has beaten CLL, which is a type of blood cancer. At the time he was diagnosed, there were very few options for treatment and almost no outside support. And now, 20 years later, Terry Evans is cancer-free. He has seen the birth of his 11 grandchildren, and he has grown the CLL Society from a tiny support group of 5 individuals to a total of 35 groups across the U.S. and Canada. Terry's CLL journey is truly incredible, and he is here today to tell us all about it and to tell us how we can beat cancer. All right, Terry Evans, welcome to the show.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's great to see you. So you've had an amazing journey with CLL, and my first question is, how in the world do you pronounce it?
It's Chronic Lymphocytic Leukemia.
Chronic Lymphocytic Leukemia.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
And can you explain just real quick what it is? Because
Sure.
it's so confusing.
Sure. Basically, it's the most common form of adult leukemia, and it is basically a leukemia cancer of your immune system, and your immune system is made up of different parts, but this particularly attacks your B cells that are part of your lymphocytes. So basically, your B cells don't act the same way that they would in a normal person. In a normal person, they have a lifespan, and they die off after X amount of time, and in these cases, they just stay alive and they never die, and so you have to basically manage them and control them, usually through some type of treatment.
Okay, yeah, and I was doing some research prior to this podcast, and even backing up further, the lymphatic system. Lymphatic system.
Right.
I didn't know that it was almost like a secondary blood system in a way. Mm-hmm. So you have lymph.
Right.
In your body that sort of lubricates the cells and moves nutrients around just like your blood system does.
Right. Basically, the lymphatic system is all over the body. You have lymph nodes that exist behind your legs, in your groin, in your neck, and these are the things that basically help protect your body from infection. And actually, the spleen is jokingly called the biggest lymph node in your body, because it also filters the blood and acts as basically a giant lymph node in your body.
Okay. No, that's interesting. So you said the B cells are overproduced?
Right. They're not only overproduced, but there is some type of genetic defect in them that causes them to not be as effective as they were in the beginning of your life. And so what happens is that when you get diagnosed with this, you immediately have a compromised immune system, which we've been hearing a lot about in the news because of the COVID-19 issues, is that people with compromised immune systems are basically more susceptible to the adverse events of COVID-19 because their body can't fight it in the same way that a normal person's immune system can.
Okay. Yeah, no, that's interesting. And just, I've looked at the article that you sent me on Cancer Today magazine, and it says, more than 20,000 people are expected to learn they have CLL this year, and about 4,000 will die. And it's a blood cancer, most common for adults, and the median age of diagnosis is around 70. And you were diagnosed at age 52.
I was diagnosed at 52, yeah.
Okay, how was that? Because you said that in the article you were in the doctor's office and you just thought it was some standard procedure and no big deal.
Yeah, and actually that's the way that most people with CLL get diagnosed, is that it's because of something else happening in their life. Either they're going in for surgery, or they happen to wind up in the emergency room for some reason, and they do a blood test and they say, your blood counts are out of normal range. I was fortunate that I had an annual physical every year, and my primary care doctor had noticed that it had been going up every year, ever so slightly. It still wasn't even out of normal range, but he just was wondering why it kept going up. And so he then sent me to a hematologist, and the hematologist then ran some tests his first appointment with me, he said, I don't think anything's going on, but we'll run some tests and check it out. The second appointment, I went back by myself because he told me there was nothing going on. And that's when he told me that I had chronic lymphocytic leukemia, which was a complete shock to me. I had no idea what it was. I felt fine. The only way that you could actually determine that I had it was the fact that my blood numbers, actually running a specific test in the blood. So yeah, it was a complete shock, not only to get the diagnosis, but then also to be told that it was an incurable blood cancer, and also the fact that we weren't going to do anything to begin the treatment, which...
Yeah, because you're like, you're just telling me I have cancer,
Yeah.
and now you're telling me to wait.
Right. You're telling
You're
me...
like, wait, no, I can't wait.
Right. And you know, I mean, if you're, you know, halfway an A personality at all, you want to do something to fix this. You want to basically make something happen. Okay, now you've told me I've got this, so let's go and do something. And I would say in probably, I don't know, maybe 75, 80% of the when people are diagnosed, they don't do anything. And it's called watch and worry, or watch and wait, or watch and evaluate. There's all kinds of names for it. But it's a really difficult place for people to be in the beginning of their journey, because they're told not to do anything but just come back every X number of months, like 6 months, and we'll check your blood again and we'll see if you need treatment then. And it's really hard to put your head around. And I'd say that the majority of the people that get diagnosed really struggle with the fact that we're not going to do anything right now. We're just going to wait.
So that's a kind of an odd scenario, because I was looking at the stats and it said that something like 84, here it is, the 5-year relative survival rate is approximately 85%. So I guess that's pretty high.
It's good. It's much better than it was, you know, 10, 15 years ago. The survival rate is much higher, and basically it's because of all the new treatments that have come out. So I would say that 20 years ago the survival rate was probably closer to maybe 10 years for patients, and now it's really gone up considerably. But I think one of the factors in that they say the average age of diagnosis is around 71, 72 years old, and yet I was diagnosed at 52. I know a lot of people that were diagnosed at an earlier age, even in their 30s. And so I think some of that data is old data that they've been pulling from statistical, because, you know, when you look at the internet, everything that's reported is old. Basically, it's because something happened at some point in time previous to this, because they can't predict the future. So what they do is they basically say, well, 10 years ago, the average age was 72. Although people in our support group, I would say the average age in our support group is probably in around mid-60s. So, and I think that is also making the survival rate higher too, because I think just because of general medical testing that people wind up getting diagnosed by accident earlier.
Okay, so they get diagnosed earlier, and then we're living longer in general, so
Correct.
That could skew the...
Correct.
Do you think do they wait then because the treatment is so much more, I guess, damaging or deadly than the disease itself? Because it seems to me like if they're basing this on, you know, a 5-year window, that you'd want to get started pretty soon, but...
Yeah, and in the beginning, you know, when I was diagnosed, there were only 2 actually treatment options. One of them was chemotherapy, which has adverse effects and events on the body long term because it basically damages your DNA. And the second one was a transplant, and transplants at that time, 20 years ago, had a horrible track record. About 25% of the patients never even made it out of the hospital.
What's a transplant?
A bone marrow transplant.
A bone marrow transplant.
Transplant, right. So they either take blood from either a close relative trying to get the highest match they can, or they put it out on a blood transplant list where people get tested to donate their own blood for people, and you can find matches out there. I know several people. I know a friend of mine had a transplant, and his donor was from Israel, because people, basically register for this all over the world. But 20 years ago, the success rate of transplants was just miserable. You die in the hospital, or you have horrible diseases that they call graft versus host disease, which means your body keeps on trying to reject the transplant. So you have all these horrible symptoms, and then, about 25% of those people don't last a year, and they die. And then you have these other symptoms that last sometimes the rest of your life. So transplants 20 years ago they were like a last ditch option if you didn't have anything else available, but the results of them were so bad that, in fact, now with CLL, in terms of a regular bone marrow transplant, it's done very, very infrequently. There are newer transplants that are being done now that have a much higher success rate with it's a much easier path than the old bone marrow transplants. That's why they're almost never used now for CLL patients.
And what's involved in a bone marrow transplant? I've heard they're painful. Is that literally sticking a needle into your bone and drawing?
It used to be that to extract them, I think they took it out of somebody's breastbone. So they stuck a needle in your breastbone and they sucked out your marrow.
Yeah.
It was more painful, I think, to the person giving. But now it basically can be done just with the blood, and basically they extract the cells out of it, and then they then transfer those cells over to the new patient. But typically, what happens in a transplant is that they knock your body down so far, the recipient's body gets basically bombarded with chemotherapy, sometimes radiation, to basically try to eliminate any disease that might be lurking in your body, and then they transplant you with somebody else's cells that wind up trying to take over your whole system. You can actually change blood types in a transplant.
Oh, wow.
So, yeah.
That's a pretty big shock to the body, I would imagine.
Yeah, all of a sudden, you're no longer...
It's like a different person.
Yeah, you're no longer an A, you're an O, but they, the newer transplants that they have that are out there right now are much less, I think the side effects of them are much less, and some of the results of them have been pretty promising in a lot of different blood cancers, not just CLL, but other blood cancers as well.
And they do both chemo and radiation or all three of those at once?
In the olden days, they would give you chemotherapy, and sometimes, depending on where it was located, radiation as well. And the newer regimens don't require that. If you did a typical transplant, it would, but if you did one of the newer transplants, they don't want you to be too sick, so they might do some prepping of you before you actually get the new type of transplant, which is called CAR-T, C-A-R-T, and it stands for chimeric antigen receptor for the T cells. So you take somebody's T cells out of their body and you infect them with a cancer-killing virus, and then re-inject those back into the person after they've, basically been sitting for a week or two growing. And then you re-inject them, and these new cells basically attack all the cancer. And I know several people that have had it. I know several that have done really well, and they are cancer-free 2.5 years out after having this. I know some that they did not do well. Their cancer returned. So it's almost like a crapshoot. You don't really know if it's going to work. You hope it will, but maybe for you it just wound up being not the right treatment. But it's much less. it's like a 30-day experience where you go into the hospital and you have this treatment, and then at the end of 30 days you walk out. But it can be pretty miserable, and people go into comas. They hallucinate. One of my
So you're sitting in a chair getting these.
Yeah.
this stuck
Basically, you're in a
you? Okay.
bed. Yeah, you're in a
Okay.
bed, and you're basically getting infused with this. But it's only I think the infusion itself only takes like an hour to get, but then you have to suffer the side effects of it. But it's getting better. It's getting better and better how they manage the side effects and also match it to the patient itself so that they have a better chance of success. So yeah, but that's kind of out there. That's probably would only apply to maybe right now, maybe just a very small percentage of CLL patients, because it's almost in some ways still a last-ditch effort for treatment. You would use many other things probably before you got to that point. But for me personally, it happens to be one of the things on my futures list. If I do relapse, then this could be something that I would wind up trying, because I've gone through so many treatments and failed them and relapsed that there'll have to be something really new or really different for me to respond to it.
And what was the name of this new one that you said? The
CAR T.
CAR
Yeah,
T.
CAR T.
Okay.
It was actually developed at UPenn, and there were some doctors that were trying to treat children that had leukemia, and they were really tough cases, really gone through everything, relapsed, and they wound up giving it to them. And there's some of those people that are now out over, I think, 20 years from the treatment, and they're still cancer-free. So that what they've done is they have to kind of adapt it to each type of blood cancer a little differently. So I think the first ones were ALL, which is primarily a younger person's leukemia, and then I think AML maybe, and then they've crossed over to the chronic diseases, chronic lymphocytic leukemia, because like we said, I mean it's the largest population of leukemia patients that are diagnosed every year in the adults are chronic lymphocytic leukemia.
That's the largest number of diagnoses.
Yeah.
Of all the leukemias.
Of all the adult leukemias.
Okay.
Correct.
How many leukemias are there? I mean, most of us know it as being a childhood disease.
Oh, there's more than I can even count. There's hairy cell and follicular, and there's just any number, and they all, I mean, are leukemias, which means that they're a cancer of the blood system or the lymphatic system, but they all have special nuances. And
Great. I feel like
it's pretty accurate.
The treatment seems very much like a crapshoot, like you said, but then
are
there misdiagnoses or mistakes? How many mistakes are there in this whole process?
I mean, of all the people that have passed through our support group, I actually only know of 2 that were diagnosed incorrectly in the beginning.
Okay.
CLL is pretty easily identified, and so there aren't a lot of mistakes. Where the dilemma comes in is that when you get diagnosed, there's no need to treat, or immediately. Generally, I mean that's a general statement, but usually it's not. And so what happens is that about 25% of these people that get diagnosed never actually need treatment, which is something you can tell somebody who's newly diagnosed that, I may not need treatment. But on the other hand, we don't want them to get too complacent and just say, well, I don't have to worry about it then because I've got a 1 in 4 chance of me never needing treatment. And, we tell them, well, no, you should still learn as much as you can about the disease and get your team lined up for doctors and possibly look at treatments depending on what your genetic marker tests come back, because everybody is different when they do wind up getting treated. No 2 people respond the same to treatment. What may work for me may not work at all for somebody else. I may take a drug and have no side effects, and another person may take the drug and have side effects so bad that they have to actually stop taking the drug. So, and that's the thing about CLL that's so unique, is that no two people will wind up being exactly the same in terms of their journey, unless they're not treated at all, and that would be the same. But when you get into treatment, you know, some people, they get really long remissions, some people get really short remissions, and there's no easy way to actually identify who those people might be.
And it could be all ages, all backgrounds.
All ages,
Yeah. How long would the remissions vary?
Oh, I've had a remission, well, let's see, my current remission is probably about 26 months. That's my longest remission in my 20-year journey. My shortest remission was 1 month.
Oh, that's a bummer.
So, yeah, I basically, after stopping treatment a month later, I relapsed and had to, you know, basically figure out what to do next.
Was it symptoms that came? Well, first of all, what are the symptoms? Like,
Well,
how would a person know other than a test?
excuse me. Yeah, so as the disease progresses, there are certain things that the doctors would look for. They would call them B symptoms because it's a cancer of the B lymphocytes. And because what happens is that those things basically get to a point where they start interfering with things that would normally, you know, your body gets basically too many of these cells. And this can cause things like weight loss, it can cause fatigue, it can cause just general overall tiredness, which is, you know, the fatigue and tiredness symptom is something that is really difficult for somebody to explain to a doctor, because it's not like really any type of fatigue that, you know, you may have run a marathon and you're really tired and you're really sore.
Yeah, I get tired just from
yeah,
living.
yeah. And this
sleeping.
type of fatigue is, I not only don't want to get out of bed, I can't get out of bed.
Oh, it's bad.
Sleeping for 16 hours a day.
Okay, so very severe. When you say fatigue, it's like
when
you can't function.
Exactly, you can't function, and that would be generally something that the doctor might look at and say, you know, this has gone on too long, too far, and we need to get you in treatment, just because of the fatigue. Generally, you know, people seem to think that, oh, if my leukemia gets out of control and my white blood count gets too high, they're going to start treatment. Normal blood count for white count is somewhere $10,000 to $11,000. $10. Normal blood count is somewhere between 10 and 11,000. That's the normal white blood count. And so people think that, well, when it gets to 100,000, you're going to treat me. And that's not the only thing they look at when they want to begin treatment. What they would look at is a combination of these, what they call B symptoms. You know, have you lost a lot of weight? Are you tired? You know, those are the types of things that they put into the whole equation. And generally, a lot of people, their lymph nodes start increasing in size. All of a sudden, you know, a doctor can feel your spleen, or they can feel lymph nodes in your groin or your neck. I know people that have had lymph nodes so big in their neck they look like chipmunks, and they grew beards to cover them because they were just so large. And that's a sign that, you know, your body is basically producing way more of these than it can handle. And it also sometimes interferes with other blood cells like platelets and red blood cells. And when that happens, which is one of the things that happened to me in my journey, is it basically crowded out all of my red blood cells. And so I wound up becoming very anemic, and actually was one of the first things that we had to treat was the anemia, because I had too many white cells. But when I first had my first treatment, my white blood count was over 550,000.
Oh my God.
Yeah, so
And normally you said it's 10
normally
to 11.
10, 11,000.
Wow.
And at one point in time, it was actually over 750,000 during some of my treatments. So, you can imagine that if I have that many white counts, white cells, what happens to all the other blood cells? That they basically get crowded out. And, a very common side effect is a low platelet count or a low red blood cell count, because the white blood cells are basically crowding out everything that's in your body.
And red is what carries oxygen.
Red.
So that makes sense why you'd be fatigued. You have no oxygen
Exactly.
going to the rest of your body.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. So, so you talked about your support groups, and
Yeah.
So how was that? How did you get involved in that? Was that through the hospital? Did you create it on your own? How did you? Because you've been doing this a while now, and I've heard you've
Right.
gone to quite a bit of groups and discussed
Right.
all these issues.
Well, when a lot of people get diagnosed, they know no one else with this disease, and that was my situation. I didn't really know anybody else that had this, so there was nobody to talk to except for my doctor and the things on the internet. And as we know, not everything on the internet is absolutely factual or true.
What?
Yeah, I know. It's hard to believe.
Okay. Except this podcast.
Except this podcast,
Yes.
which you have to believe.
Yeah.
So I started just kind of browsing some of the internet forums, and not feeling really good about them, because some of the information was just opinions as opposed to facts from medical journals or studies that had been done. But and I had actually already begun treatment, and I had come to the realization that I needed to really be more involved in my own decision making. I had kind of ignored it for 7 years, and so I decided that when I began treatment, I said, I should really know more about this. And actually, my wife, who's a nurse, actually probably knew more about it than I did when I began treatment. But I just ran across somebody's post, and they said, "Oh, we're having a group of CLL patients meet at this house," and it happened to be about 8 miles from my house. And so I wound up going to this meeting. I had never, ever been involved in any type of support group. I, kind of thought they were for sissies that, why can't you suck it up and deal with this on your own?
There's people crying on each other's shoulders, and what
Yeah,
are we
right.
going to get out of this?
A bunch of people that look horrible. They've got cancer, and they're
Yeah.
all weepy, and I didn't want to do that. And I found it was just the opposite. These people were so upbeat, and they were so knowledgeable about, and there were only probably about, in the first meetings I attended, maybe 6, 7 people that attended these meetings, but they were so upbeat. They were just, it was amazing. It was not what I expected at all. I just was overwhelmed by their willingness to share, and how warm they were, and how good they all looked. They all looked great, not like you'd think of, a stereotypical cancer patient might look. So, I started going to these meetings, and they met monthly, and so I started going on a regular basis. And as we kind of grew, we advertised through the internet on some of the online forums, and our numbers grew, and we wound up originally meeting in a house, and that migrated to basically a restaurant, back room of a restaurant. And then that migrated to somebody's corporate boardroom where we met. And so along the way, because I was going all the time, and I really wanted to be involved, and I saw the benefit, especially to new people that had just been diagnosed, and here's a place that they can go. I mean, it took me 7 years to get 8 years to get to my first support group meeting. And we had people coming into the meeting that had been diagnosed the month before. And so these people are really deer in headlights people, and it was a way for us to basically try to understand their diagnosis and hopefully to make them feel better. So as this went on, I became more involved in running the group, and was asked by the guy who originally started it if I would mind taking over the group, and I said, yeah. And I in my career, I was a manager. I led people, and I was involved in a credit union. I was on the board of director of a credit union. So this was not all foreign to me, actually running a meeting and trying to do some of the administrative things that always go along with running a meeting, like sending out emails and, confirming the location. So I wound up basically leading the group. And that group, actually, from that group, it evolved into a nonprofit called the CLL Society that basically its role is to support only patients with CLL. There are a lot of organizations that support blood cancer patients in, under that umbrella of all blood cancer patients. And they do a great job. I mean, they've got a lot of funding, they get a lot of money, they give a lot of money to researchers. But there was never anything out there that specifically dealt with just CLL patients. And so the way this was started as a nonprofit was not to compete with an organization like Leukemia Lymphoma Society, which were, they're a multi-billion-dollar organization. And we were just kind of grassroots and trying to get going to support this network of patients. And because we knew that CLL was the largest adult leukemia out there, we knew there had to be people that would be interested in learning more and going to meetings. And so we started more formally with the group, and we actually hooked ourselves up with a medical center, asking them if we could use a meeting room that they had, and they allowed us to do that without restriction. They didn't come in and want to be a part of the meeting. They just basically gave us space, which is kind of how we run our meetings. We don't want an overseer. We don't want somebody to say, well, you can't say that, or you can't say that you had a bad experience with that doctor. Yeah. So it's kind of unfiltered. It's kind of an unfiltered environment that we have for patients. And so from that, we decided that there was a need for a second group in the LA area. So we actually founded a second group with one of the people that had come to the original meeting, becoming the facilitator and leader of that group. And then we started advertising the fact that we were creating these groups and would, people be interested in joining. And but we'd need somebody to lead it and do the administrative things, et cetera. And so from that start, which was probably about now 4 to 5 years ago of creating these other groups, we now have 35 support groups throughout the United States. Actually, there's 33 in the United States and 2 in Canada. And so... And
it started out with 0 at the time that you entered.
It started with 5 people in somebody's living room.
Wow, good job. That's incredible. 35 groups in North America.
Yeah, and the attendance, of some of the groups is small. It's like 5 to 6 people, and then in other groups, like, I run the group in Orange County, California, and that group is the largest group by email addresses. We have about 180 people on the email list that we send invitations out to every month. And before COVID, in our live meetings, we had generally a attendance of about 30 to 40 people a month would come to these meetings. And so, we basically developed a curriculum. We developed a handbook for facilitators, how to lead a meeting. Some of these people had never had any experience at all in running a meeting, and the things you kind of don't want people to do and what is allowed. And so we developed this curriculum, and we felt it was important that they get trained, because we realized that every group was going to be a little bit different, but we wanted them to follow kind of the founding principles, if you will, of the group, of how we run our meeting and how we allow, people time to talk, and we don't devote the whole meeting to a speaker that comes in and then everybody says goodbye and good night, but we allow people to interact within the group. And so these are the things that we try to basically teach the facilitators when they come out here. We fly them to California. We have a training session with them, and we schedule it on the same day as our support group meeting. So what we do is we have the training, and then Well, we take a small break, go out to dinner, and then we take them back to our meeting, and they get to experience firsthand how a meeting actually operates. And they get to see the interaction between the facilitator and between all the group members. And that model really was working well until COVID, which really...
Things have changed now, yeah.
Which changed everything, because we realized that we could not meet in person anymore. And so we had to come up with an alternative, which we did. We basically developed a Zoom. We have corporate Zoom accounts because in a just personal Zoom account, you're limited to 40 minutes for a free one. And we realized that not everybody would have a corporate one, so we created Zoom accounts under the nonprofits umbrella where they can go unlimited amount of time. And so we had a training session for everyone, all the facilitators, on how to run their meeting in a Zoom environment and what to do, what not to do, how to mute people, how to make sure that your meeting's secure and not, run over by outsiders. And so we've been doing those meetings since March in a virtual format. And the interesting thing is that it's really created a whole new dynamic where we really feel that there's a value to online, in-person communication and talking. We think that the one-on-one or the one-on-group environment is really beneficial for reassurance and, to have those chats after the meeting with somebody that has a problem maybe that they don't want to bring up in the meeting. We still think that there's a place for that. But what the Zoom environment, what the virtual environment has kind of opened up to us is that we have people that don't want to drive. They don't want to drive. I mean, our meeting is on Tuesday night in Orange County. We have people that actually used to drive 2.5 hours to get to our meeting through rush hour LA traffic, which is a nightmare. And in all the other cities, it's a nightmare too. Atlanta, Chicago, New York. I mean, all of these cities have really problems with traffic. And so this has kind of opened up this whole new opportunity for patients to join the support group, but not having to travel. And it also wound up opening up, maybe people don't live necessarily in the area all year round. We have snowbirds from Florida that actually belong to the New York City group, but they can still attend the New York City group from Florida. And so it still allows them to keep that connection as opposed to losing it for 6 months because they weren't there and then having to go back at the end. So actually, there's a lot of discussion now how this is going to impact, much like education. There's a lot of discussion on what's education going to look like in the future. And we realize that there is some significant benefits to having a virtual format meeting. People can sit there. They don't have to get dressed. They don't have to drive. They can just, basically be a part of the meeting. And our attendance, I would say that our attendance is probably just about the same as it was before. But I would say in probably at least 50% of the groups, our attendance has increased by 25-30% just from the fact that we've created another avenue for them to join the meeting. Now, unfortunately, sometimes in older adults, this format is not really something that they are comfortable with and they don't know how to do it. We do offer training to individuals on how to get into the meeting, but there are still people that, you have to have a respectable bandwidth, on your computer. You have to have a computer that has a monitor. We have people that choose not to show themselves during the meeting, which I find very curious because they would come to an online meeting or an in-person meeting and be present, but they don't want to show themselves on camera. So
it's just, I think COVID's definitely changed just how we interact in weird ways. I think I was going to ask you, what are the COVID effects? How has that affected your meeting? And it almost seems like it's improved it.
It has. I think
if you're sick, you don't want to travel.
Right. And I think in a lot of ways it has improved it. I think we're still feeling a little bit guilty that we're not able to offer the in-person, because I mean,
but that could come down the road. I mean, you could maybe do both. And
yeah, we've talked about that of maybe doing a hybrid, and I mean, from a facilitator standpoint, I recognize the challenges of doing a hybrid meeting, because I can't be talking to a group of 15 live people and then also looking at a laptop screen and seeing if somebody has raised their hand for a question. So you'd almost have to have two facilitators run the meeting, one that manages the online portion and then can interrupt me in the live format. But I think, that a hybrid solution is probably, or maybe you do one live meeting 1 month and then the next meeting you do virtual.
Yeah,
Something
I mean,
like,
I think at this point, the options are unlimited.
Right. And none of this existed.
Yeah.
Zoom as a company only existed 10 years ago. That was the very first, that's when it was put together. So 10 years ago, this would have never been an option. Basically, we would have shut down everything in terms of resources for patients. And now here we are offering perhaps even a better method of, patient education and support.
Yeah, and the name of the program is the CLL Society?
CLL Society is the nonprofit, right.
Okay.
And it was founded by a doctor who actually had CLL.
Okay.
And actually, as a patient, went through many different treatments. And I don't know, can I say his name? Is that allowed?
Yeah. Sure.
Okay.
I think you can.
His name is Dr. Brian Kaufman, and he was a family practice doctor up until about a year ago when he retired. And he has been through multiple treatments. He had a bone marrow transplant and failed that. He then went on a very early version of one of the drugs that I'm on and did remarkably well for a period of time, but then he actually wound up getting the CAR T transplant about 2.5 years ago, and now he's disease-free. And he's basically devoted his life to this, challenge of trying to support CLL patients specifically, and has connections to all the big medical centers, all the top name doctors, and gets them to write articles for there's a website called the CLLsociety.org, where we have a lot of patient testimonials. In fact, the article that was written about me last month was, it's posted up there as a link, because to give people basically patient experiences of what they've been through, and then there's talk about all the new treatments and the things that are in clinical trials, and even things on why you should opt for a clinical trial. I mean, a lot of people think that they don't want to be a guinea pig. Go, no, I don't want to. I'll get it when it's finalized. But I've been in 3 clinical trials, and I can tell you, this was not altruistic on my part. I didn't do this for the good of humanity. I did it for myself.
Yeah.
I wanted to basically to
staying alive is a good reason. I'll excuse you for that one.
And so I felt personally that I got much better care. I'm lucky that I live within close proximity to a major research hospital that offered me clinical trials, and I'm a big proponent of clinical trials. I think that that's the only way we're going to get to the point of ever finding a cure or finding a treatment that works for almost everybody. Because without testing, you're never going to be able to. Everybody's going to basically kind of stagnate and be in the same place. But the changes that have happened in the CLL environment just in the last 5 to 10 years have been unbelievable. There was several years ago, but CLL was named Cancer of the Year. Now, what an honor you want to be. So.
I'm not sure how to take that. Is that good or bad?
How do you get that award? But basically the gist of it was that there were so many advances in this particular type of cancer with truly amazing results that they did. I've heard some anecdotal stories that when some of the successful drugs started, coming on the horizon, they didn't even have enough production ramped up to make the drugs that they could use because they didn't really know if it was going to be that successful. And so because of that, the patient landscape, where it used to be you'd have maybe one option or maybe two options, now a patient can have up to 6, 7 different options when they start treatment, and which is really amazing. And of those, there's only one that would be considered chemotherapy. All of them are targeted or immunotherapy regimens that have far less side effects, that don't damage your DNA, and the drugs that are out there today are truly amazing compared to what I was originally offered. I was offered chemotherapy or transplant.
Sure.
That was it. There wasn't anything else. And so now, and many of the new treatments are oral, so you're just taking a pill. You don't have to go to an infusion center and get an infusion, sit in a chair for 3, 4, 5 hours, but it's all oral now, and which, again, is very beneficial to the patients because they don't have to travel, they don't have to set aside a portion of their day, they don't have to deal with infusion side effects. They basically just have to take a pill, and not that it's totally a piece of cake. I mean, it's, there are a lot of people that still have reactions to pills. I don't want to lessen the fact that it's just an easy road because it's a pill, because for a lot of people it's not. A lot of people, most people, I would say, have some type of adverse event when they take these drugs. And some of them are mild. I still have them. I've been on one of my drugs now for almost 7 years, and I still have brittle fingernails. Now, you would think that in the scheme of things, that brittle fingernails would not be anything I would even worry about. But the bottom line is, it gets annoying that I catch my fingernails on everything that I touch. And
they just
it splits
fall
them.
off, or they will chip off or something.
Yeah, chips off, and so. But most people can. I mean, I can live with that adverse event. I can live with that. And a lot of the drugs have GI issues associated because they are, fairly harsh treatments. I mean, they're in your body fighting against the cancer, and sometimes they're doing things unrelated to fighting the cancer. They're messing up your, liver, or they're messing up your GI system. And so just like you see on TV when they advertise drugs and they go through the side effects, which is everything you can imagine, because in the trials, they have to report every adverse event. So if I tell them that I had a sore throat, they have to write that down.
May cause sore throat.
And then they will note how many people actually reported having a sore throat. It could be totally unrelated to the drug, but they have to report it. And if they get X number of them, then it becomes something that they would list on a sheet. But generally, the side effects of most of the oral therapies are relatively minor. Diarrhea is generally one of the most common things. AFib is another one with some of the new targeted agents, but sometimes that can be managed by other medicines. So they realize that, and so it kind of balances out. To stop the treatment because I have a split fingernail or even diarrhea for a day or two out of the month is not enough for me to.
Yeah, in the grand scheme, it's much better.
Exactly.
Sure.
Yeah.
I was going to ask you about FDA changes in the regulatory structure. Did anything the FDA did cause the the increased number of trials, or is it just sort of happenstance with increased technology? And what was your experience dealing with the FDA or just the process? Has the process changed?
I don't think the FDA really. I think in some cases they were a hindrance, and I'll touch on that in a second. But I don't think that, they do consider drugs that are unique. They give them orphan drug status, which means that they can fast track them. But generally, fast track means, 18 months, 24 months. That's fast track. And as we're seeing with COVID vaccines, they're not happening overnight, and because they have to go through documented trials, and so I don't think that FDA really had much to do with changing the landscape. I think it really had to do with the scientists that were, developing alternate. They were actually looking at what they call the pathways that are associated with a blood cell, and where the changes in the pathways happen, and if they block this pathway, does that mean they can stop the cell from proliferating? I think it's the scientists that really are the ones that made the changes so dramatic over the last 10 years. But my personal experience with the FDA was I was in a trial, and it was called the Resonate trial, it was a phase 3 trial, but it was also what they call a registration trial. And a registration trial is the trial that the FDA uses to either approve or deny the drug for use in patients with a particular condition. And so I was in this trial, and it was comparing an older drug to a brand new drug. And it was a worldwide trial, actually. The European Union was involved as well as the FDA, and there were about 390 of us worldwide that were in this trial. And the drug was ibrutinib, or now known as Imbruvica. And it compared itself to another drug, which was a monoclonal antibody, which basically kind of attacks a marker on the cell called CD20 in a B cell. And they knew that it worked. It would get rid of it, but it's not a long-term treatment. So they compared these two, knowing that one would probably work better than the other. Well, I wound up on the monoclonal antibodies side, which was a 6-month and done treatment. And that was the one in the 7th month I relapsed. So I stopped those were infusions. So I stopped my treatments. The other 190 people continued on their pills. And I wound up not only stopping, but relapsing. And so then you have to ask yourself, okay, what's next? Well, the way this trial was written is that there was no crossover, which means that no matter how well the people in the other arm were doing, if you failed it in the arm you were in, you could not cross over to the other drug, which was really
Seems a bit harsh.
It was harsh. Yeah, is a good description of it. And I knew this going in. I mean, it was written in the documentation, but I thought that there would be some opportunity for me to cross over eventually. And it turns out there wasn't. It turns out that they were very, very strict in following the guidelines. And keep in mind, this is a registration trial, which means that the FDA does not want any changes to this trial before they make the either approval or denial. And at that time, it looked like they were having a success rate of 80 to 85% of people responding to the ibrutinib arm. The numbers were off the charts. A good response could be 30 to 40%. Well, this was double that. Mm-hmm. And so it really came up to be a question of why aren't you allowing these people to cross over to the other drug? But because there were so many different institutions involved, it was really a difficult thing to do. But some of the top CLL doctors in the United States got together, and one of them, who happens to be at University of California at Irvine right now, Dr. Susan O'Brien, wrote an editorial in a journal called the ASCO Post. And the title of her editorial was, "Where is the Equipoise?" And one of her statements in this is just a one-page article, basically saying this is absolutely criminal what you're doing by not allowing. And she was only talking about, there were only 190 of us that this applied to. But she felt so strongly. She's a top CLL doctor in the United States, very well respected. And she wrote this article and said, basically what you're doing is, by not allowing them to cross over, you are basically allowing them to die. And she put that in the editorial, which was really powerful. I mean, it was unbelievable. So with so much support behind it, they started re-looking at this, and they then allowed them to change the protocol. But you think, okay, just rewrite this, and we'll now allow these people to cross over. Oh no, that's not how it happened.
Okay.
They had to go back to every single institution in the trial. And in the United States, there were, I think, at least 20 institutions. And they have written up their clinical trial documents specific to their organization. In order to change that, they have to take it back to the Institutional Review Board, the IRB, in the institution. And even if it's a change of one sentence, they said, okay, if they relapse, you may now allow them to cross over. It has to be approved by these boards at every institution.
Each person has to be approved.
Yeah. So in our case, there were 5 of us that were a part of the trial at UCSD, and so all of our cases had to be approved. But the FDA also had to weigh in and say, well, okay, this makes some sense. But the European Union had to weigh in it as well. And so this doesn't happen overnight.
No.
And here, I've already relapsed on month 7. And my treatment options at that time, I'd become chemo-refractory. I couldn't have any of the standard treatments that were out there. There was nothing else that was really new and cutting edge out there for me. And this went on for a couple of months where I basically did not know what I was going to do. And so what happened was, I went in for an appointment on Tuesday, and my numbers were increasing, my symptoms were increasing, and he said, and he knew my past history because at that point in time, I'd already failed 4 treatment protocols. So he knew how fast I would relapse, and he says, we've got to do something. He says, if we don't hear back from them by Friday, we're going to start you on another treatment, something he had come up with that was a older standard treatment, but we knew it probably wouldn't work that well. On Thursday, I got a phone call saying that everything had been approved and I was now allowed to cross over and get the drug. Literally, it was within 1 day of me starting a different treatment.
And how long did that total process take?
It took 6 months.
6 months to
6 months
to
from
cross
the time.
over.
Yeah, I stopped my the one-arm treatment till the time it got approved. So in 6 months' time, I was basically in limbo.
And that was because you knew, you also knew that you could cross over eventually if you went through this whole process. If a person doesn't take the initiative and doesn't, beat down people's doors, so to speak, they would just be languishing.
Yeah,
I mean,
and I emailed people on a basically almost daily basis, asking them what the status is, basically reaching out to people that I had come in contact with over the years, and trying to get support. I would call them on the phone and leave nasty messages about why wasn't this happening. I actually knew the medical director she became the medical director at the drug company that actually made this drug, because she had previously worked where I was treated. And so, I thought, there's got to be a way for this to happen. And it really was only because the top CLL docs got together and they basically said, this is totally unfair. There was no justifiable reason why they would not allow us to cross over. If anything, it was going to serve them better to say, look, these people failed this arm, and now look how well they're doing, on the new drug. So that was my only experience directly with the FDA, and I can't blame it totally on the FDA. I put some of the blame on the pharmaceutical company for not basically writing a better clinical trial with more options for patients. But certainly the FDA was restrictive in not allowing the changes to happen.
Sure. It's a big institutional bureaucracy.
It's huge.
Well, it sounds to me like the biggest lesson in all of this is affect your own rescue, so to speak. Like, that's something we say in the military when if you're shot down or in a bad spot, they say, look, affect your own rescue. You have to actually participate in this, and
Yeah.
going through the support group seemed like that's a good place to start for most people. And then you can learn about all these different ways.
Yeah.
You can team up with people, and you can start
Right.
affecting the process more.
You know, one of the things we realize is that, support groups aren't for everybody.
Okay.
Not everybody feels comfortable in that environment. Not everybody feels comfortable sharing their, information. Or we've had people come to the meeting, come one time and never come back. They just basically say, well, that was okay, but either they don't want to be reminded of it, or they maybe feel like they're ignorant because, we're talking in literally a foreign language when you first get diagnosed. And we're basically now throwing these terms out there that mean absolutely nothing to them. And I think some people feel like they're, less of a person because they don't know as much. But they don't realize I've been doing this for 20 years. This is not something I knew in fact, I knew nothing when I was first diagnosed. And I knew practically nothing for the first 7 years.
Yeah, I had the first question out of my mouth. How do I pronounce it?
Yeah, right, exactly.
And I'm a fairly educated guy, but so if
right.
you don't feel comfortable, I think that's very natural, and you'll get through it.
Right. And we've had people come to the meeting that one of the things that we tell people when they come, you don't have to speak, you don't have to share. You can just sit and absorb it. You can just participate. And we've had several people come to meetings and not talk for 2 or 3 meetings. They just don't, they would rather just listen and try and figure out what's going on and where this might fit in for them. But I think this brings up the other issue is that some people maybe are just more analytical in terms of their approach. And if we can provide similar information on the website, if we can give them a place to go where they can sit and just absorb as much as they can or as little as they want to, trying to go through this at their own pace, I think that the website through the nonprofit is equally as important as the support group meetings, because it just gives people a different avenue for them to help understand, manage, support themselves. One of the big things in our groups is we include caregivers in the meetings because we think it's extremely important that if you have somebody that is going on this journey with you, they should be informed as well. And in some cases, the caregivers are more knowledgeable than the patient. Basically, they turn to their partner they bring to the meeting and say, well, I don't know any of my test results, but they have them somewhere.
Yeah.
And so, it really...
it's for everybody.
It does, and some people come alone, some people come, some people have not told anyone about their diagnosis, not family, not friends. The only people that know are their medical team and the people at that support group meeting. And I consider that to be I feel blessed to be able to provide them a place that they can share and talk about this when they haven't shared it with anybody else.
Yeah. Yeah, I can't imagine that, going through that journey by yourself.
Right. It's really tough.
Facing death by yourself is just overwhelming.
We have a lot of people that are single, without partners, or maybe no close family. And this outlet for them has just been truly a godsend, because they now have a group of people that not only can help them, but also understand. And I felt exactly that way. I call for questions before the meeting each month, and a person a couple months ago said, would you bring up the issue of depression? And a huge deal in cancer diagnosis, being depressed but it's not talked about a lot. Just in general, depression is not talked about a lot. But then you combine that with a cancer diagnosis, and you say, wow, does anybody else feel this way? Does anybody else feel like they're in a black hole and they'll never get out? And so, again, I brought it up as a topic, and I said that, that we had put some resources out on the website for, depression and how to, start dealing with it. I don't think you can say you'll ever cure depression, but I think you can maybe
manage it. Sure.
help deal with it. So, I just think that offering people different opportunities. I mean, that's why I feel so passionate about speaking about this. I talk about this all the time. People say I want to interview you for an article, and I've agreed to do that numerous times, just because I feel like it's kind of my obligation of where I was in the beginning and where I am now. I mean, I'm fortunate to have had the opportunity to use, several experimental drugs, and some worked okay, and the one I'm on right now is actually a combination of two drugs that did not exist 10 years ago. And I'm doing really well on this. I'm in complete remission. They can find no evidence of disease. But the question becomes, will that change in the future? Will it come back? Will it find a path around the blocking agents of these drugs? Do we stop one or two of the drugs just to see what happens? And because I'm on a clinical trial, there's a lot of different options that could be available to me. But we're considering stopping one of the two drugs that I'm on and seeing what happens. And if it comes back, then possibly restarting it. We have a saying in the groups that you shouldn't ever be complacent with where you are, even though I'm doing really well. And I'm not naive enough to think that it won't come back someday. And if it does, I want to be ready for that. I want to have the next things lined up so that when I do need treatment, I know what those options are. I know where I can go. I've got 3 world-class medical centers that are within 80 miles of my house that all have opportunities now for treatment. When I was first diagnosed, there was one place you could go in all of Southern California for CLL treatment specific. Otherwise, it was just a general hematologist, and they treated maybe 2 or 3, 5 of CLL patients in their practice. But now we are fortunate to have City of Hope and close by, and University of California, Irvine, and University of California, San Diego are all top-notch CLL research centers that they're doing amazing clinical trials. There's not. I would never hesitate to recommend a patient to go to one of those 3 places for put one of those doctors.
What are the names of those places again in Southern California?
City of Hope, which is in Duarte.
It's where? I'm sorry.
It's Duarte, okay. California, which is up the San Gabriel Valley. It's just from Huntington Beach. It's probably 35 minutes. University of California, Irvine is in Irvine, California. Actually, the medical center is in Orange, but it's next to Irvine. And then University of California, San Diego, which is in La Jolla.
Okay.
So those are all relatively close. And then you have some ancillary ones at UCLA and a couple of other places. But, one of the things we try to tell people when they get diagnosed is to get an expert on your team. And an expert isn't a doctor that has 4 CLL patients. My medical team at UCSD, they basically have over 1,000 CLL patients, and that's it. They don't treat other blood cancers. Well, they do if something happens to a patient that had CLL and they, migrate to some other form of leukemia or lymphoma. But so they have 1,000 of these patients. They have seen basically probably every scenario and reaction to drugs, but you need somebody like that on your team, so that if you have an exception to the rule, which is what happened to me originally, I had something that the doctor did not really understand. My local doctor didn't understand it, and it was only because I had transferred my care to a specialist that they just said, oh yeah, you've got that? Okay, here's what we do for that. And it was no big thing. But if you don't see a lot of CLL patients and you are only following the guidelines published, which are generally out of date, the month after they get published because the changes happen so quickly in this field. They might not even know that some of these drugs are available for patients. But we'd like people to go have a specialist on their team just from the standpoint of being that sounding board, so that if your local doctor says, okay, it's time to treat and we want to give you XYZ, they can take that to the specialist and they can say, here's what was recommended. And is this a good idea or not? And we've had any number of people that wind up going to a specialist and said, you don't need treatment yet. I would not treat you. It's too early. Let's just see what happens. And or that's the wrong treatment for you because of these reasons, because of your markers. And they don't have to be your primary doctor, because some of these guys, they used to travel all over the world giving speeches, writing papers, and so they're not available all the time. So you have to have a team. You have to have not only somebody that you can, make sure that you're making the right decisions, but you also have somebody locally that can treat you. And if you wind up getting really sick, you can go to and say, hey, what do I need to do? My chest hurts. And of course, that's a bad thing now with COVID.
Yeah. There's so many other overlapping scenarios.
I know.
Yeah. Wow. So, what are your future plans then, in terms of treatment or the group? What's happening, and how? Well, again, with the COVID thing, I'm sure things have changed.
Yeah.
How do you do things?
It's interesting because when they started talking about all these guidelines and COVID, make sure you wash your hands, make sure you stay away from sick people. I knew any number of people that already wore masks on planes when they traveled, because you're diagnosed with a compromised immune system. You're more susceptible to getting an infection and more susceptible to getting pneumonia, actually. And nowadays, most of the people that have CLL die from an infection. They don't die from the CLL. And so we were already aware of these, guidelines of hand washing, and a lot of CLL patients carry sanitizers around in their pockets with them before all this started. So I feel like we're kind of one step ahead of the game in terms of being more aware of this. But there's also been some studies that when CLL patients get COVID, about 30% of them die, just because they've got the compromised immune system and they can't fight it. So, for me personally, I'm trying to, stay healthy. Like I said before, they can find no evidence of disease. I'm trying to figure out what the next steps are. The clinical trial that I was in, my last one, which started about 26 months ago, I was patient number 1 in the trial. I was the first patient, and because it was a very finite list of things that you had to qualify for it. They didn't have many people that qualified for the trial, and so they actually stopped the trial recruiting patients in July of 2020. But we still continue on the trial, even though they've stopped recruiting patients. So I'm doing incredibly well. We have to figure out what the next steps are in the trial, and do we want to stop the drugs, or do we want to just continue taking them? I can put in an editorial comment here that the drugs that I'm on, it's a clinical trial, and in a lot of clinical trials, the drugs are paid for by the pharmaceutical company. But this trial was called investigator-initiated, which means the people down at UCSD came up with this trial on their own, and they presented it to the drug companies, and it was using 2 drugs by 2 different pharmaceutical companies. One of them agreed to pay for the drug, and the other one didn't. And so I basically am on my own to pay for one of the 2 drugs. And here's the editorial comment. If you are on Medicare, it is illegal for pharmaceutical companies to subsidize payment of your copay. They can't do it. And if I was on private insurance and I was 58 years old, they could basically allow me to pay $50 a month for this drug because they could subsidize the cost of the drug. Now, you have to ask at some point in time, how is this fair to people? People of Medicare age are the ones that are probably going to need the drugs, and yet you're telling me that I can't get any assistance. Now, you can get assistance, but it's all based on the poverty level. And so if you qualify financially, you can get assistance, but it can't be from the drug company. It has to be through foundations and that are given grants of money, a lot of times by the pharmaceutical companies.
Okay, so we're just reversing the streams of money, or we're just moving the streams of money around. Okay.
Right. But if you don't qualify financially, if you make too much money, if I was Bill Gates, I'd write a check for my drugs and I wouldn't care. If I was, on Medicaid and I didn't have a lot of resources, I would basically get the drugs for free, because you can get them for free if you qualify based on your income. But if you're in the middle, basically you can't get any assistance and you wind up paying for it. So I have a Medicare Part D prescription drug plan, and but there's what they call the donut hole, which means you have to meet the deductible before they start putting you in a different category. Mm-hmm. And the donut hole is about $5,000 out of pocket. So in the first month, the drugs that I'm on are both about $12,000 a month retail.
It's an expensive donut hole.
Expensive. So the first month you go into the donut hole, and out of pocket you must pay $5,000, and then the second month you're on the hook for 5% of the cost, retail cost of the drug. Well, the retail cost is $12,000 a month, which means that you have to pay out of pocket $600 a month. So all told, I'm paying about $6,600 plus the $5,000 originally for the donut hole, and so it's about $11,000, $12,000 a year out of pocket for me that I have to pay.
Wow.
And and like I say, if I was on private insurance, not on Medicare, and if I was in a different income bracket, I mean, I'm fortunate to be in the income bracket I'm in, but if I was in a different income bracket, the drugs would be paid for with relatively no or very low out-of-pocket expenses.
Could you just get private insurance? I'm so uneducated on this process.
No, once you go into Medicare, you're in Medicare, basically,
Okay.
and you can't get out, if you will.
Okay.
Now, there are other ways to do it. You can go into, there are different insurance plans that pay for different portions of it, but in general, the population that's in Medicare, they, in order to cover the drugs, most people add a Medicare Part D or prescription drug plan.
Right.
And you have to pay X amount per month for that plan. And so, it's really challenging. And that's why people stay on private insurance sometimes as long as they can, because that's the kind of thing that can creep up on you at a later date. And then all of a sudden you're out of pocket this money. And again, am I not happy with it? Sure. Does it beat the alternative? Yeah. Because,
what are you going to do?
Being dead is not a very good alternative.
It's not. Wow. Yeah, there's so much, there are so many things to go through in the medical industry. It makes your head spin. So, wow. Anything else you want to chat about before
I did mention that, I'm always looking at the next step down the road.
Mm-hmm.
And basically, I've got a couple of things that look promising. And one of them is that CAR T therapy, where they take the cells out of your body and they, basically infect them with a cancer-killing agent and then re-inject them. And it's getting better and better. That treatment in the beginning was horrendous. It was just so bad. But now they're managing the side effects of that better, and it doesn't take for everybody. But if it does take, it's basically a complete cure. And so it looks really hopeful, but the downside to it is that it's about a $250,000 cost.
Holy moly.
And Medicare will pay a portion of it, but the last time that I saw some numbers, your copay would be about $40,000, even if you're on Medicare. So
That's
right now,
per year? Or is
for
that
the
total?
total treatment.
Okay.
Because it's basically a 1 month treatment and you're done. There's no follow-up treatments or anything.
$250,000 for that one.
$250,000 for that one stay.
Okay.
Yeah. And, you know, obviously if Medicare doesn't pay for more of that in the future, then there's going to be less of an opportunity for people to get it because they can't afford that. So right now, even me looking at it, you know, what I would be looking at is a clinical trial. I would be looking at something where, and they are still testing this in several of the places that I would consider going to, medical institutions, they still have clinical trials. So on one hand, I'd kind of like to, you know, come out of remission early so I could get into one of these trials. But on the other hand, I don't want to come out of remission because I want to ride this for as long as I can. So I mean, if there are no trials available for CAR-T, then I would probably just move to one of the newer agents. There's several newer agents that are out there for people that have failed a particular treatment because of a specific. I failed one of my treatments for a specific reason. Well, now they have a drug out there that addresses that specific reason for failing. So it's conceivable that I could basically enter into a different trial for a different drug, even though I, you know, failed the first version, maybe the second or third version. Because now they're on actually second and third generations of these drugs that came out, you know, that were approved 6-7 years ago. Now there's multiple versions of these drugs out because they're learning more and more about the treatment.
Yeah, it sounds like always have a plan. This thing can come back. Get your team together, find a group, be aggressive about your own treatment. And it sounds like it's not, it's, with any major disease, especially cancer, you can't just rely on other people to just tell you what to do. I mean, that's what I'm gathering from this conversation.
Yeah, I think
that's
you know,
the big lesson.
You have to be your own advocate, I think, or at least have a team that is an advocate for you. Like when I was the sickest, you know, my wife was basically my team, and she was driving me to doctor appointments because I couldn't drive at that point in time. And so, you know, you may not get to that point. You may be able to drive, you know, and do this, but you know, the more you invest in understanding what your options are and where you might go for treatment, the better off you're going to be in the long run. And I know people that's not for everybody. I have a friend that was diagnosed, and he basically said, "I'm not going to worry about it. I'm going to let the doctor worry about it, and whatever happens, happens." Now, me, I want to scream at him. I want to tell him not the right approach. But you know what? I learned a long time ago that, you know, when I try to press my views and what I think is the right thing to do on somebody, they're going to dig their heels in and say, that's even more reason why I don't want to do this. And so you can't force these decisions on everybody. Everybody has to kind of, and I wound up lucky enough to being in such a bad place that I realized how ignorant I was at not planning for what had happened to me. And if I would have known more early on, I would have never been as sick as I was. I would have never gotten to that point because things would have been managed totally differently. And, you know, that's why I share my story. I say, you know, hey, I've made plenty of mistakes in my journey. And my you know, what I try to tell people is I don't want you to make the same mistakes that I made. And again, you know, people may prepare for something that never happens. Those 25% of patients that never need treatment. And I said, but you know what? You're a much smarter person because you know, and you can share that knowledge with other people as well.
Other people can benefit from that.
Yeah.
That's fantastic. Anything else real quick? Because we can, if not, we can wrap this up. But
no,
it sounds like that's a big one.
I think I've
It's a lot of information.
Talked out.
What's the name of you still do the blog? What's the name of the blog?
My blog is called
Is it Terry's CLL? Did I get that
Terry's
right?
CLL Journey. Wait a minute,
You've been doing it so long.
I have my handy phone here. I can go to my own blog. Yeah, let's see. I think it's Terry's CLL Journey at blogspot.com.
Okay, yeah, I'll just throw it in there
that's
when
what
I
it is, so.
wrap it up.
Yeah,
But,
yeah.
well, that's fantastic. Let's see if there's anything else we can chat about. So the CLL Society we hit, the blog we got, future plans. No, I think it's fantastic. Anything else real quick?
I can mention the blog real quick because when I was first diagnosed, everybody wanted to know, well, how are you doing? And so I'd send out emails to people, and then I'd remember, I didn't say this, and then I'd have to send out another email. And so right about the time when I got the sickest, I decided that I didn't want to send out emails anymore, and I wanted to create a blog. And that way, all I'd have to do is just tell people that my blog had been updated. And so I started posting, I think, in about 2008 to my blog, and I've detailed almost every part of my journey in my blog. Every change in treatment, results of treatment, so it's pretty detailed in terms. It's not a light read. Mm-hmm. It's not for everybody. But if you put in keywords and you say, well, did Terry have this drug? It'll show up. It'll pop up as a link. So, it was just a way. It was a way for me to kind of just be able to share this with people. Kind of catharsis. I just able to talk about it, but not have to personally talk about it to somebody. I could sometimes I just write ramblings on it. And it's not just medical stuff. It's information about, my family. And when I was first diagnosed, we have 4 children, and none of the 4 children were married. And of course, when you get diagnosed, am I even going to see them get married? Am I going to ever see a grandchild? And fortunately, they all of them got married, and we now have 11 grandchildren, and it's truly amazing. I mean, to think of where I was with basically, 4 children, and now it's a total of 19 people that are in the direct family.
See, there you go. That's the difference right there. It's like you did all this and you made it just a few years longer than maybe you would have.
Right.
And now look at what you have.
Right.
11 grandchildren, and you've 20 years later.
Right.
A great life, and you're now technically, I guess, cancer-free. I mean, you said you're not naive to think that it won't come back, but for now.
Right now I am.
That's incredible.
And feeling good.
Yeah.
I
just went golfing before you came over here, so.
Yeah, I know. So, but even with that, I know there's going to be new treatments out there. They haven't stopped treatments. Hopefully, the highlight of any doctor's career would be to able to find a cure for this, so that they could absolutely say, if you do this, you'll be cured. And they're not there yet. They're getting closer and closer, much closer than certainly when I was first diagnosed. And that's always hopeful too, to see those people out on the front lines still making that their mission. They're still, basically that's their goal in life, is to find a cure for this. And so, that's pretty impressive.
Hopefully one day.
Yes. Yes.
Wow. Well, Terry, thanks so much for
You're welcome.
sharing this journey of yours. You're an incredible inspiration. I'm sure a lot of people are going to learn from this, and they're going to have the same success that you've had. So thank you so much.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
All right, folks, that's it. We'll see you next time. Bye.